Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit. Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, the beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? And today we are speaking with our special guest, John Prendergast. This is our second time speaking with him, to our great delight. John's work is, as you'll hear, or as you may already know, very in tune with our point of view here on Bliss and Grit. A favorite quote of his perfectly shows why. Somewhere between the Self-Improvement Project and the Transcendence Project is being an embodied human being. Yes. John beautifully integrates the awakening path with psychotherapy. He's a licensed therapist and a former adjunct professor of psychology at CIIS. He's also the author of 2 books. Today we're talking with him about his most recent book, The Deep Heart. We will talk all about what he means by the phrase, the deep heart, and what can happen when we're able to land there and experience it. The book's going to be out December 10th, but in the meantime, if you want to find more of John's work, you can go to his website, which is listeningfromsilence.com. It's a really rich conversation, so let's hop into it. Okay, here we go.
Well, hello, Brooke, and hello, John. It's so great having you back on the podcast.
It's a delight to be with the two of you again.
Thank you.
As we were just joking, Brooke and I have so many questions that we would love to explore. And I think that's a reflection of how much we resonated with your new book called The Deep Heart.
Wonderful. Oh, I look forward to the conversation.
Well, we thought probably the most intelligent approach would be to begin with what you're meaning when you use the term, the deep heart. It's very evocative. Mm-hmm. What do you mean when you say the deep heart?
Okay. So my experience of the heart is multidimensional. So it has a localized, it can be felt locally in the center of one's chest, not the heart, not the physical heart, but more the heart area. And when we begin to explore into the depths of this area, this is really what the book is about. And many people are not touched heart, only briefly with their hearts. This may be because of lack of attention or because of conditioning, because it was just too painful to sustain, awareness in this area, because it's an area of tremendous sensitivity and feeling and also knowing. And this is a very important point, right? So we're not just speaking of sentiment or emotion. We're actually speaking about another way of knowing and of being that's accessible through the heart area. So this is part of the depths of the heart is the psychological piece, which is more the early conditioning that we have compartmentalized often and suppressed and is the main domain of depth psychotherapy. When we go into our core stories and the related somatic contractions and emotions such as shame, sense of inadequacy, sense of not being lovable, all of these are painful areas of the heart that actually go quite deeply. And in my exploration with people, either in my work as a therapist or as a spiritual teacher, we inevitably go through these different layers of the heart. And there's reasons that we avoid them, and we defend against them because they're really, when we were little, they were overwhelmingly painful sometimes. And so we just learn to shut them down and move on with our lives. But at a certain point, we have to turn around and face them again and be willing to feel what's there and recover actually what we left behind. And this speaks to another point of the depth of the heart. Because in the kind of freezing and compartmentalizing that we do, we leave behind very precious aspects of the self, essential qualities of being. So beneath the kind of, the disturbed and distressed and painful experiences that we hold in the heart is a place of great innocence and tenderness and a place of essential qualities. And now we're moving really from kind of the inner child, kind of the conditioned inner child, to, we could say, the magical child, or to, poetically speaking, a soulful area. And this is very, very deep and very tender. And when we open to this level consciously, so much gratitude and awe and love and compassion just naturally springs forth. And it's also where we feel a tremendous intimacy with one another, still on a personal level, but a very profound level. This is where we we maybe have a close friend that we haven't seen in a year, and we're with them again, and immediately it feels as if no time has passed. Or, we understand another's experience just in a few words or with no words. And there's a profound sense of resonance and respect and love. Depth of the heart as well. It's very precious and often described in poetry and song and justly celebrated because of the beauty and the depth. And there's a deeper dimension of the heart. And this is it's like the back of the heart opens up. I'm motioning this way, but it's really a motion back. And it's a movement of falling back, actually, into something universal, infinite, as a field of awareness that is loving and all-encompassing and all-embracing. And when this opens, we have a sense that all is well, no matter what. We have a sense of our own inherent wholeness. Like, regardless of our conditioning and our wounding, there's a sense of wholeness that is profoundly touching to tap into in a profoundly healing field that we use as a resource to deal with. And as our sense of wholeness, as it becomes increasingly conscious, we also begin to feel a sense of non-separation, an undivided sense, not only with others, but with the whole of life. And this is really the greatest awakening of the heart. So, it's a profoundly important aspect of our human experience. It's one thing to, have a very clear mind or to awaken from our thoughts and our images. It's very important to have a sense of deep ground. But if we don't have the openness of heart, depth of heart, and awakened heart, we're not fully experiencing what's possible. And I think it's something that we're all opening toward individually and that we're doing collectively. And it's something that's extremely important, actually, on both of those levels. Yeah. So that's why I wrote about it. And then, in our prior interview, we talked about in the book In Touch and some of our inner knowing, one of which is open-heartedness. So I really wanted to hone in on this particular facet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And having sat with you and having done some of this work as a practice experientially, it's so interesting because it is, you use the word a portal, that it is a portal to experientially knowing the things that we can maybe be told on a spiritual path, that we can trust life or that there's a benevolent force. But this is a way to actually perceive for ourselves. And what I found in doing the work with you, I really experienced just how much I and the whole culture orient from here. And for those who are listening on the audio podcast, I'm kind of cupping around my eyes and my forehead. It's like we're all crammed into relating from this one tiny piece of the body. And the work with you coming into the heart was experiencing so much more depth of the body. But when I landed in this place to discover that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and loving support, which is just, fascinating to me because I am of this culture. So it's like discovering this whole other dimension of reality that so far from my experience just keeps going and going. What brought you in your work to this heart? Because it feels a little bit like Alice in Wonderland for me sometimes. Like it's that much of a different dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a different dimension. And, as you say, I think we're all of us as conditioned human beings, and particularly in, more post-industrial civilizations, we tend to localize attention in the eyes and in the forehead, the prefrontal cortex. And we have more data to process and more problems to solve. This is certainly favored in our education system. And so we tend to localize attention here. Maybe at moments we feel our hearts more, but that's secondary. So it's a big, I do speak of it as a kind of pilgrimage of attention. And really the big shift is really from identifying with our thoughts and images really to this other way of being, or I could say the way of being, heartfelt and oriented being. So your question is, how did I get interested in it? Or
what led you into discovering this portal?
That's a very good question. I don't think I have the answer. I think, let me sit with it for a minute, rather than, okay, so what comes from me is really the love of truth. Like, and the recognition, I mean, that's really foundational. It feels like that was working as an underground current in my spiritual quest. And, there were a lot of twists and turns and dead ends and confusion. But there was something very quiet and very profound that kept kind of inviting me to go deeper, I would say. And that invitation really was to go deeper than thought. And it was interesting in just this awakening, the process of awakening, that even when there was profound clarity that I'm not who I think I am, and that there is no thought and no story that can in any way adequately describe who I am fundamentally, still that was not realized on the level of the heart. That was like a clarity of mind. And there was just a knowing. And here I was fortunate to have, good guides to say, keep going. What you've realized on the level of the mind can also be realized on the level of the heart. And so I think the love of truth and the willingness to be honest with my own experience in terms of continuing to feel a subtle sense of separation was a fuel for the investigation to continue. And really the profound kind of realization of the inherent wholeness of the heart came when I saw that I was in a kind of almost compulsory, subtle seeking mode. I was still looking for outside of myself, something. I mean, it was no longer outside in terms of any person or place or experience. It was more subtly inside. If I could just see something clearly enough, right? The most subtle quality of light, that's kind of what I was after. Then I would know myself. And what I saw was the seeking was endless. And this,
we can relate.
It would just go on and on and on. And it was like a real moment of revelation for me to see the endless nature of it. And in that honest seeing of the truth of that, there was a sudden shift that happened. And the recognition of this inherent wholeness. Gratitude arises as I talk about this. And how that happens, it's just, I think it's a process of natural maturation, willingness to really see and feel deeply what's true. And this leads us to a more and more intimate realization of who we really are. So I think that's the best I can.
That's beautiful.
describe.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And of course, Brooke and I relate to the endless seeking we can do, and the seeking for the light in particular, I relate to. And there's a lot you say in the book, John, that struck us about how the human heart needs a foundation of safety. And that if it feels unsafe, we won't stay open for long. And Brooke and I had a lot of interest in that, and probably more than one question about it. But what I thought might be helpful for everyone listening is if we could start to look at what developmental trauma is, because, you know, most people in the world are now familiar with what they call capital T trauma. And I feel like developmental trauma is kind of getting out there. People are talking about it a little bit. But if we're going to talk about safety for the heart to be open, I think it would be worthwhile to discuss what made it feel unsafe in the first place and the kinds of pains that we're, turning away from experiencing.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a really important subject. I mean, some of us are lucky enough to have, had a sense of safety growing up, where we have a sense of our primary caretakers are consistent and they're fair and they're warm and they're attentive. And that gives us a sense of foundation of trust in life and trust in our own experience. There's a certain mirroring, that of our own goodness and of our own orientation to life, that we're in touch with reality. And that gets internalized all unconsciously and creates a kind of foundation. However, in its absence, it really has a profound effect in what we're calling developmental trauma. And this is really trauma that is about the absence of a steady, warm attachment or bond with a primary caretaker, mixed in with sometimes large T traumas because of a lack of attention. It could become from neglect and abuse. But the point is, it's chronic and it's very early, and the impact on the nervous system and the body is considerable. Mm-hmm. So even before age 3 or 4, when we're starting to have some kind of continuous narrative, in terms of ourself and the world, these imprints are being absorbed from the family system and, from multi-generations, actually. It's getting passed down and absorbed. And so it creates a sense of distrust of oneself and of life. And this is a significant obstacle to sustaining an openness of the deep heart. And so I think what's important is then to be able to recognize and face that. Mm-hmm. And often it means facing a sense of terror.
Yeah.
Not just fear, but actually a profound, subtle, and sometimes not so subtle sense of terror. That is to say, a fear of annihilation. Mm-hmm. That could be from abandonment, that could be from attack, that could be from, some specific trauma, medical trauma, or an accident. But usually it's more, developmental in terms of relationship. Mm. And the impact is it creates a shaky foundation. And when there's a shaky foundation, it just doesn't feel safe to be so open, to be so tender, to be so undefended. And the fear that openness will lead to what it is that we feared most, in other words. And this is very interesting to see because we project those fears onto the unknown, mm-hmm. right? So as something begins to open and it's less and less defined and it's just felt as not a thing, right, as no thing, what the mind will do is then project onto it what it fears the most. Mm-hmm. So if the fear is engulfment, for instance, kind of a parent, a narcissistic parent who kind of swallowed a child to make them an extension of themselves and be a kind of trophy, then this openness, when a heart begins to open, that's the fear that gets projected on that openness. Mm-hmm. Similarly, abandonment, it's like no one's there, nothing is there, no sense of support gets projected actually onto a field of loving awareness. And so images of like empty space, dark, cold, unsupportive, rather than a sense of being held. So this comes around to the theme of holding, actually, which is a very profound theme, I find, working with people, whether or not there's been developmental trauma. It's like to begin to relax into a sense of being held, right? And this is why actually beginning to access presence as a holding environment is very profound and very helpful. And I use this image a lot when I work with people. It's like, feel yourself held, first perhaps by gravity, right? By the earth. But know that you're held by something greater than that as well. And just feel what happens to your body mind as you sense into that. Right?
It's powerful.
It's powerful, isn't it? There's a kind of letting go. Because what we do is we contract in a fundamental way when we don't feel held. We do it anyway as a separate self. This is kind of the posture of the separate self, is a kind of a knot or a contraction. And as it releases, there's this sense of openness as well. If we feel a sense of holding, a vast holding, loving space, there's a kind of melting and an opening into that. And then the next step is to know ourselves as that. Right? That's where we feel undivided from the whole of life. So finding a place or a sense of being held and holding provides that sense of safety, and also gives space for the fear or the terror to be released and opened and met with the light of awareness. And this is another image and word that I use a lot, which is to feel yourself held and feel by the light of awareness. And it's like floating on your back in a way, in something that's warm and buoyant and luminous, and just noticing what that feels like. And it's very interesting because the whole body mind begins to reorient to this field of loving awareness. And it's a melting, it's a releasing, and it's a profoundly transformative process as well. It's like the body mind, so conditioned to take itself as separate and to be in defense, begins to discover its source as awareness itself. And it discovers its true nature. So it's like the body mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations have all been waiting to kind of discover their source and to relax into it and to know themselves as that. And that really provides a really profound field for the unfolding and healing of the conditioned body mind.
Yeah. And you're describing, how the opening of the heart has to be met with the capacity to experience safety. And I appreciate you.
Capacity.
Yeah. Describing what that would feel like in a more granular way for people who don't have that. Because I see a lot, we hear from listeners, I hear from clients that they can be really hard on themselves, of course. If there are ruptures in this ability to sense safety, they can be hard on themselves. Why can I open and then I close again? Why is there like this aperture open, aperture closed? And there has to be a real appreciation for the fact that we just need to slowly and tenderly give ourselves more of a ground in experiencing safety. That it doesn't come all at once. There are some of these spiritual ideas, you get the big everything all at once. Yeah.
Yeah, it would actually be overwhelming, and the body mind wouldn't be able to actually process it and integrate it consciously. And people have had those kind of big openings, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes induced by substances or unusual circumstances. And it's true. It's an interesting phenomena, that kind of opening and closing. And it's when I work with people, I just let them know this is totally normal. And part of it is the fear that we were talking about, the fear of losing control, the fear of not knowing, and all, the conditioned, stories and feelings that we project onto that. But part of it is just the default mode of the system. We're just used to functioning in a certain way. And so we have openings, and then there's a recrystallization of the body-mind, not entirely back to where it was, but kind of stretched a bit and a little more luminous, a little more translucent, a little more open to its true nature. And this seems completely natural as an unfolding process. And and so we get out of the judging it and setting a timetable for ourselves and thinking we should be further along than we are. And, we drop all of that. And that actually gives space for us to be with our experience as it is and allows it to unfold even more naturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it takes away some of the complexity. Like you wrote somewhere how we can begin to identify with this survival pattern or with this survival way of being. So when we can contact these places like terror, or you do a great job of speaking to these other kinds of existential places we can meet, the fear of annihilation, like you said, the aloneness, grief, right? That all of us can meet these if we have a rich inquiry. And I feel that, I just lost my train of thought as I got so into talking about the existential issues for a second. But okay, yeah, I think I'm circling back. I'm here. So the piece where sometimes we can start to re-identify narrative to these states, right? So that it's not just that I feel terror, it's that I feel terror because X, Y, and Z, and I shouldn't feel terror, and terror means this. Mm-hmm. And the same with grief, and the same with aloneness. So I feel that what you just said helps release some of the complexity. It's almost like, it feels like we go forward and then we double back on ourselves mentally sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's part of the default mode, isn't it? To reconstruct a narrative and then place ourselves in it. It's, it's what the conventional conditioned mind does. And so, the more we see that, the less seriously we take it too. It's an interesting point, because as you know, I weave back and forth between psychological work and spiritual work, and I don't see them as being essentially different. So there's a value to make sense out of our experience if we haven't been able to, in other words, to construct a narrative. Like, okay, I understand now why I react the way that I did. I can see the causes, I can see the sources of that. And that can be helpful if we hold it lightly, if we don't take it too seriously. And similarly with, being able to name what our feelings are, it's like, okay, that's terror, right? But once we kind of name them, or that's shame, or that's rage, or that's unworthiness, then we can let go of those labels and actually be with them in a much more direct and innocent way. And, this is what, to be close to our experience, particularly when we're sourced in presence, feels like the most important principle and allows them to shift because our experience is always changing. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we tend to identify with these constructs and these feelings, but, we come to see that they come and go and they don't define who we are. So we feel ourselves more as that spacious, loving awareness, which is actually the truth of who we are.
I'm wondering if, because I'm sure that there are people listening, and I know, I have been the person in the past where I'll hear things like, oh, you just label, oh, that's shame, or, oh, that's terror. But if you're being engulfed by it, it's very hard to do that. But having had the opportunity to sit with you and really having my life changed by your work, I think it would be great if you could describe what the process of heartfelt inquiry looks like, because the process is very alchemical. Like it really transmutes these things. It's not just a mental layer. It's not at all a mental layer of observing things. So how would you describe your process of the heartfelt inquiry? Maybe we can paint a picture of that a little more.
Okay, well, there are two facets of it. One is really more sensing the heart area, and the other is inquiring into relevant beliefs. And it kind of depends what people are experiencing in terms of what I may accent, but I always like to start with a sense of presence as much as possible. So if we were, for instance, now to inquire into some sense of some pull of attention into the heart area, I would say, before we go into it, let's just take a few deep breaths and notice yourself being held, right? Feel a sense of all around. I'm going to do this in an accelerated way, and feel the space, around you and around your body, all directions, and within your body. And just notice it's the same space. And the space is aware. So in this, we invoke or evoke this field of presence. And, some people will contact it more intimately than others, but we start there. And then I'll say, bring your attention to the heart area, if that's actually where attention is being called, right? And just breathe into the heart. Imagine you can breathe directly into the heart. Maybe you want to put your hand over the heart area, just as an anchor to help your attention stay there. And each breath allows your attention to come more deeply in. And we enter with innocent attention. We're not trying to change anything or fix anything or get rid of anything. We're actually interested in being intimate with our experience, right? Just feel into what's here now. And there's permission to be quiet or to describe whatever might be there, and an invitation to sense into it even more deeply and closely. And often just with that, things begin to open and reveal themselves, right? Just that simple, focused, innocent, affectionate attention. These layers begin to reveal whatever it is that needs to be felt. But I also, so that's more like this invitation to sense subtly. And then I sometimes ask, what's in the very center of this? Don't think about it. Mm. And that don't think about it is an important instruction rather. It's like, don't go to your mind. It's just be curious. Let it show you, what's there. And sometimes that simple question allows a very different experience to begin to unfold. So, for instance, if we're feeling into an area of deficient emptiness, a sense of kind of an area that feels very dark and empty and like a bottomless pit, just that we spend a few minutes just sensing into it and then just asking, what's in the very center of that? And something deeper begins to reveal itself, often essential qualities of being, a kind of radiance, the kind of natural qualities of the heart that were covered over, right? Because it was unsafe for them to reveal themselves. And sometimes it goes beyond essential qualities, and we feel ourselves as that field of loving awareness, the great heart. So that's kind of a sensing. And then the other kind of complementary question that I'll ask, or path that I'll take, is as they're sensing it all. And often this is intuitive, something that I may sense is happening as I sit with someone, but people can sense for themselves. It's like, is there a belief that goes with this? Mm-hmm. Again, don't think about it. Let it come to you. It will be something very simple in a child's, language, just a few words. Like, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable. And if something does come, and often it does, then, what is your deepest knowing about this belief? Don't think about it. Just be open to what comes. There's no right answer, right? An image may appear, or just a sensation in the body. That's often how, it works for me. There's a subtle sensation, a subtle feeling, sometimes an image, maybe a word. maybe a memory arises, maybe there's just a direct knowing, but now we're entering into a very intimate dialogue with our heart wisdom, and a spontaneous deconstructive process begins to happen that often just we feel as a release or a kind of melting and opening. Mm. And again, we may tend to dismiss that as like, well, that's not an answer. So a little bit of education is helpful. It's like, no, that is.
Right. That's plenty.
This is your inner wisdom. Right?
I just had that happen with a client today. She's like, but, and I'm like, no, this is good.
This is really important because the mind will dismiss it. It's, it's trying to grab onto something, or maybe it is a word, but it's like, oh, well, I knew that already. That's not the point. The point is there a shift, right? An opening, a release that happens. And we begin to listen in this way, and we enter into a virtuous cycle of transformation. We realize, okay, I'm really touching in to a deeper truth. And this is where the light of awareness begins to be infused, into the conditioned body mind, and particularly in the heart area as well. For instance, yesterday I just did an online event with about 30 people and focusing on the heart. And it was very interesting to see how much grief came up for people. Some people who said, oh, I don't feel anything. I'm numb. Dogs rolling in, and just sensing more. And then this very profound grief. Sometimes people were in tears. And it wasn't the grief of missing someone or something. It was the grief of leaving themselves, leaving what's essential. And this is, speaking of existential issues, this is existential grief. Mm-hmm. It's like when we leave home, and we all do it, knowingly and unknowingly, and we leave what's most precious behind in order to adapt. And then we circle around, and often, it's in adulthood, in our 30s or 40s or later, and we come back to reclaim knowingly what was left behind, and what we experience this grief. And it's very important to allow that grief to arise. It's part of the melting, actually, and allows the joy of the depths of the heart to begin to emerge, and a sense of homecoming. Mm-hmm. This is another very, very common theme as people feel into the depths of their heart. There is this sense of, at last, at long last, I have found my way home.
Mm-hmm. I love those words, the virtuous cycle of transformation. And it's so obvious in your openness, so much of those essential qualities can come through along with the pain. And I had, written a whole question and underlined a lot on that chapter on grief. One, because I see it in my clients, but two, in myself. I just had a session Friday with someone, and underneath a belief about I can't do it was a feeling of terror. And underneath the terror and the panic was grief. And it was grief, like crying my eyes out grief. And, this isn't my first rodeo. I've done a lot of this work. And to see still the depths of the grief, and I just wailed. Yes. And so when I read your book, there were a few things, the terror and rage. I've had a ton of rage in my life coming from this powerlessness.
Yes.
And then the grief. And so I thought, if we could bring some of your insight to these very common experiences, because you have such a loving way of articulating things, I think it might be very helpful for people.
Well, I hope so. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I've been exploring this territory for so long and in such depth, both within myself and students, and, and supervising and training therapists, and working with people who are in the awakening process. And this is the human psyche, right? And it's multidimensional. We have these domains of just pure being and luminosity and radiance and love, and then these that feel divine in a way, and then we have this very human lived experience right? Relational experience with many disappointments and heartaches and joys and sorrows and defenses. And it's so important to, if we're really interested in embodying this understanding, right, in just in our very ordinary lives and day-to-day relationships, this work is just so important. So important not to leave out anything, not to leave out any dimension, right? Because we can get fixated on a psychological level and work on ourselves endlessly, particularly if, we have that orientation. We can get fixated on a so-called spiritual level of being, and just be wanting to meditate and go to retreats and attend satsangs. And yet our ordinary life is often hijacked by, our unresolved emotional and psychological material. And so to be fluid in a way, to be able to move fluidly between levels and understand the relationship, I think is really, really important if we're going to live this full dimensionality of our human experience in our ordinary life. I feel deeply dedicated to that in my own life and the life that I work with. And that's really, why I share this work and this approach as a kind of distillation, as to help people, decode this experience and be with it in a way that's really transformative.
And if I can just want to highlight or zoom in on something that I have really found in using this process myself was it was about switching or growing more capacity for the experience of receptivity. That the mind or my habit, my conditioning was always go out and get, or striving or figuring out. That was all this mental energy, and this process that you're describing and this unfolding as you sit in presence and inquire has the energetic quality of receiving something, like literally. And I'll say this sometimes to people, literally like sitting at a table and a friend is walking over to you carrying a plate of food, and all you have to do is sit there and receive the food. And that in and of itself has been so reparative for me. And I think for so many of us in this culture that is go get it, strive, figure it out, work hard, that we're these separate selves that are achieving something. It's healing just to have the experience like, oh, I can grow. There's all this in here that I can just receive. It's just here for me. I don't have to earn it. I don't have to perfectly figure it out. And yet it is, I think, pretty foreign culturally, the capacity to receive something that's already right here, something that's innate.
Yeah. Well, this is really the path of, I think of it as the path of recognition. It's actually seeing what's actually here, what's really true. And as we do so, as we recognize our native wholeness, actually, our inherent wholeness, we become increasingly more open and receptive, and we discover the powerful, spontaneous quality of transformation that comes from that, not from our willfulness, but our willingness, right? And so this is such an important theme, because we're so much into striving and achieving and proving and disproving, and it's very strong in this culture, but I think we find it in all cultures as well. And so this is really another stage, I would say, of development. It's like we go out and we try to get it, right? We make our mark on the world. We see what our capacity is. We develop those capacities. In a way, it's just natural. It's a developmental step to do that. And it's another step then to actually see more deeply what's true about who we are and what life is. And really, if we're interested in being happy in a deep way, in an abiding way, if we're interested in really being intimate with life in a deep way, then our focus changes. It's not so much about achieving anything, right? It's really about recognizing what's most true Mm-hmm. So it's a real shift in values, right? And that's why it's kind of interesting to see these meditation programs that are pitched for efficiency and
productivity.
Right. And actually, apparently, and I'm not an expert on this, but the research doesn't bear out that production gets better. But my guess is the meditators are happier.
Right. So there's that.
I hope at least that.
Right. And I think I've joked with people and said, I don't think gross national product is going to go up, with our meditators, but I think gross national happiness will.
Right.
And certainly individual happiness is. And so, we overlook that, we overlook the possibility of being deeply at peace and ease and filled with gratitude and happy, in the deepest sense. That this is something, it's actually our birthright. Mm-hmm. And I think we're called to this, and if we listen and begin to really be open in a sensitive way, there is that shift. There's a movement of attention kind of back to source and to embody it and live from that knowingly. So in a way, it's all, developmentally appropriate. We have to play out the game and discover its limitations and the dead ends. And for me, it's like life is teaching us, mm-hmm. from all of these experiences. Why are we here? I think it's to wake up, to recognize this and live this. It's not that life is punishing us, when difficult experiences happen. No, it's to learn from this and learn who we really are, discover our true nature and for it to be more conscious and lived.
Mm. Love that. It certainly has been experienced by me that the safer I feel and the more at ease my nervous system feels, the more I'm available to receive and to recognize as opposed to strive and do and be in certain ways. And so I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about safety. I mean, I think many of our listeners, certainly Brooke and I, have had these ruptures in trust. And we know what it's like to feel really dysregulated. And we wonder, will I ever feel safe? How will I feel safe? Which, of course, makes us only want to do more and keeps that mechanism running. And in the book, in particular, you spoke about safety in relationship to the hara, to the lower chakras and to the root chakra. And I wonder if we could add more to that conversation here.
We could. That's actually my next book.
Oh, all right.
Good. We can have a teaser.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's so interesting. I finished this book and it's like, without thinking about it, it's like, this is really, it feels like the next and probably last main piece that I want to share. Mm. And it's the part that is, it's where our densest conditioning is. Many people who are on this spiritual path, I've discovered, feel kind of cut off from the heart below, heart area and beneath, from the diaphragm and lower. And so this area of the hara, which means belly in Japanese, is an area that's much more dense in terms of instinctual conditioning, instinctual and emotional conditioning early on developmentally. I think it's primary process. And so it's denser, it's more difficult. We tend to shy away from it. And yet, it's, an extremely important part of our human experience to embrace this and begin to face these dimensions of our experience. And as we do, it's been very interesting. I started becoming aware of this probably maybe 15, 16 years ago. I was on retreat with Adyashanti, and he was talking about the hara, and it felt very important, but it was kind of new in terms of my sensitivity, and so it's been coming online more and more, and it just feels like a growing kind of warmth in the belly, and the hara encompasses, for those who are energetically sensitive, the lower three chakras, the solar plexus, the area below the navel, the second chakra, and the root chakra as well, and these all have their related themes. The solar plexus with interpersonal power, dynamics, Vanessa, I'm noticing the light from your window is just like
it's very angelic.
I'm not sure if I should get up and close them. There's purple. I don't know what.
I don't know. You look like you're a radiant auric field right now.
You're in the radiant field. Let's leave it the way it is.
Yeah. Your hara is expanding.
There it is, right, as we talk about that. I think, there's just that willingness to sense in this area, be curious, to inquire, to embrace, and kind of gradually this area begins to awaken too, and it provides that sense of a foundation. Now, one of the the theme of safety is extremely important, and it's no mistake that we're talking about it today. What's interesting is to really ask the question, safety for whom? Because so much of the safety is around self-image and who we imagine ourselves to be.
That's good.
Yes. Right. Yeah. And this hara area is more safe to be here, which is very different than do they like it? Am I presenting well?
True. Safe to exist. Right. And so does our very being that we're safe? It's an interesting question to sit with. Does who we really are require protection or defense? Can you feel what happens when you sit with that question?
Yeah, actually, I immediately drop deeper. I immediately found ground just with the question.
Ground, this is it. The ground opens up. And this is really the main theme around safety, is what we take to be our ground. Because we generally stand, when we talk about ground, it's like what we stand on. We stand on a construct of ourself, what we take ourself in the world to be. And that's not the deepest reality. We stand on what we've been told. We stand on our common sense experience. But that's not the deepest truth. So if the deepest truth is our being, then that is our ground. And that ground needs no defense and protection. And when we get this on a visceral level, it's like the sense of foundation just like really deepens and opens. Right? There's a sense of just something very stable and paradoxically spacious that we begin to sense. And the effect of that is that we're not thrown by, the vicissitudes of life, by the challenges that come. We have to deal with them, but we don't take them as existential threats. When we know who we really are in a deeply embodied and visceral way, they're not threatening to who we really are. They're situations to deal with, right? Right? But they don't threaten our sense of existence. So this is a very deep inquiry, in terms of safety and who is it that needs to be safe, and what is our deepest ground. And it's a subtle and profound subject, and it's what I want to explore if I'm up for it in terms of further sharing. But it's because it's so dense, it's very veiled, and often we confuse our image with our body. We think my image of myself is like my body. We're very identified with our body. So if our image is threatened, we don't really differentiate often between threat to self-image and threat to body. They just kind of get lumped together, and we're in alarm and hyper-arousal. But as we discern more and more deeply, there's a differentiation of that. We begin to see, it's my story of myself. It's my image of myself, not this body that feels shaky, right? And that there is a ground that's deeper, and that's part of the recognition, right? That's like, this is here. So it's a matter of pointing to it, and then deepening in our intimacy with that. It's a very, very profound, deep subject.
Yeah, those are beautiful. Right. Beautiful distinctions. I remember at some point in your book, you were talking about, I think, how we inherit our conditioning or how conditioning is passed down in families, and that, we can see through it and see that what we all really have inherited is just an awful lot of misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing, this capacity to awaken to ground of being or hara, is like an experience of, mm-hmm. Not a mental understanding, I'm not that, but an experience of the something else, the what else is there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I'm curious, as you say that, it's very resonant for me, mm-hmm. not to agree, but I feel something, Brooke. So I'm just curious mm-hmm. what you're feeling as you say that. What you're sensing.
What I feel when you talked about dropping into the hara, and Vanessa said the dropping down, and what I feel is the dropping down and then like a little twisty tie at like the perineum.
Right.
So there's like a drop down, but like
and then
not totally buying it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is like so common. And these are what I call the kind of the handholds and the footholds or the finger holds.
Uh-huh.
It's like we're kind
like
of
rock climbing.
Yeah. Except this is like free falling and we're trying to hold on.
Right.
And by a fingertip, sometimes that's your little twisty, I think.
Right.
And the twisty is just a little confusion.
Mm.
So we don't judge it. Mm-hmm. We there's something that's not feeling safe about letting go into this. Oh, what's that? What's this about?
Mm-hmm.
And, because this is such a veiled and dense and confused area, filled with individual and collective and multi-generational familial conditioning, mm-hmm. inevitably we have these handholds and footholds and finger holds. And that kind of resistance is just totally normal. But it's interesting, isn't it, to kind of feel the letting go, the dropping, and then the resistance to it, right?
Yeah, and having done the heart inquiry with you, thinking about that I can let the inquiry happen there, at the site of the twisty tie. And see, now that I have some practice with it in a different area, see what might emerge. Yeah.
And it's so often people will go through, like, there's a fear, like, am I letting go? Because there's so much of a letting go of the knowing and controlling. So much of this is about our attempt to control in order to survive, and really operating in a very different way of trust. Mm-hmm. Right? This is so much about trusting of self and of life, and that when we need to know something, it will come. When we need to respond, we'll be able to, trust is just such a deep, deep theme. And in a way, it all comes down to that, it seems to me. All of what we've been talking about, it just comes down to trust, if I had to choose one word. Mm-hmm. And we can trust, we can surrender ever more deeply. To me, this seems like an open-ended process. It's not like, I can check off the head, the heart, the hara, and I'm done. It just feels like, it's like our understanding continues to unfold. Our capacity, for compassion, for kindness, for gratitude, appreciate, just keeps opening, and so too, our sense of the ground and our deep trust in life continues to unfold. So that's important to know too. There's no, there are shifts that we can palpably feel a deepening happen, but this is really open-ended. And the more comfortable we are with not knowing in the conventional sense, right, and trusting this process of opening, the more it accelerates and the more intimate it becomes.
Mm-hmm. I love that word trust. I totally felt that. It came up a few times and it was so resonant. Brooke and I did an episode a while back on a concept from A.H. Almaas on basic trust. And it was such a revelation because we can all maybe think psychologically about a moment when our trust was broken and how it repairs. And it's a process, and we get more and more trusting. And it was such a relief, because you hear these spiritual platitudes like open up, surrender, be more loving, be more open-hearted. And it's like, yeah, you do that. The body is not in that state. And then the mind comes in and judges the whole process. And it's so much more true and loving to realize this is a process of recovery on some levels of the trust that was ruptured. And you're guiding people to do it experientially, that you can really feel how safe you are in this moment.
Well, I appreciate your coming around to it again, because I wanted to kind of describe that fear of letting go. There's often a fear of going insane or fragmenting, but it's actually the opposite is happening. And I tell people going sane. You'll feel a little shaky. It's okay. This is a benign shakiness, right? The body is releasing kind of a contraction that it's held for a long time, and you may not feel like you're in control briefly, but what's happening really is opening to a deeper ground, recovering of this basic trust, of this inherent trust in life, no matter what. And this is another really important point. This opening process, some New Age people think, oh, well, this will bring abundance, and I won't get in a car accident, and I won't get sick, and
no more suffering for me.
This is not my experience at all. But how we are with it, just our openness, our creative response, our love, really changes. And that's, because life, we get sick and disabled, and we die, bodies do. And it's just, how are we with that really is the question, not some magical thinking that, we'll be safe as a body mind. That's not in truth. But knowing our true nature as source, right? Like the difference between a tip of a wave and the ocean. I use that metaphor in the book. When we know ourselves as the ocean, right, or the ground, either metaphor, then the comings and goings of the waves, right, and the various earthquakes that may happen are okay, right? Some deep way, we no longer live in terror of life. And then we're really available to live, right? When we're open to that, when we're open to dying, we're simultaneously open to living in a really wholehearted way.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for your beautiful work and your book, and for talking with us again. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's lovely. We could go on for quite a while, couldn't we?
We definitely could.
We could just keep taking this deeper, because there's deeper layers to everything you said. And we didn't even get to the part that Brooke and I both adored so much, where you spoke about psychological maturity and spiritual awakening not being one and the same per se, and where you speak about Tantra and the human path. And we have so much kinship with your work, so we could go on and on.
Yeah, maybe another program.
Yeah. Yes. There we go.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot. I do cover a lot in the book, and we've touched on some of it, but a lot of rich themes. But fun to explore with you, particularly because, I feel your orientation and your sensitivity and your resonance. So it creates a conversation that's very experiential, isn't it? And,
it is.
That's touching for me.
Thank you. Well. We try. We really value that. And we really value that you bring that so beautifully. Yeah.
Thank you so much again, John. And I know all of our listeners are going to have the experience with us, and we highly recommend you go out and get this book. Really.
Thank you.
Huge gratitude again to John Prendergast for talking with us and for his gorgeous work. His newest book that we were talking about in the conversation is The Deep Heart. You can find more of his work at his website, which is listeningfromsilence.com. Thank you to all of you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. We will be off next week due to some Thanksgiving travel this week, but we're going to be back with a new episode after that. Show notes, including any resources, always live at blissandgrit.com. That is also where you can subscribe to get our weekly digest of what we're up to and resources that we're currently finding helpful. If you want more support, blissandgrit.com also has more information on our private coaching practices. We're so grateful for the reviews you've written, for the membership support you've provided, and for all of the notes that you sent. Thank you.